Terraria is a game with a massive modding community, with the main mod browser, tModLoader, having thousands of mods available for download. The most popular of these mods is a large mod known as Calamity mod, which adds 27 bosses, 12 mini-bosses, an event, 5 NPCs, almost 2,000 items, and more. Inside of this mod lies the opportunity for big, strong players like myself that aren't little baby idiot losers to truly challenge themselves. This mod presents two modes that allow the player to increase the difficulty of the game, Revengeance mode and
Death mode.
But the player doesn't have to stop there, and can also use the base game's hardest difficulty, Master mode. And for an even further challenge, the player can enter the seed For the Worthy to unlock the hardest possible mode that the base game can offer. So, in order to create the most difficult modded experience I possibly could, I set the game to Master mode and Death mode on a For the Worthy seed. This is the story of how I beat Terraria's hardest mod. To begin with, I made a nice character that I gave the name of the strongest person I could think of. I then made a world that I set to Master mode and entered the seed For the Worthy in order to begin the challenge. I was so focused on entering the seed properly that I forgot to change the actual name of the world. So, welcome to Wyeeett, the legendary world in which I would be facing the greatest challenge that modded Terraria has to offer. They'll write songs about Wyeeett, similarly to how they wrote a song called Gangnam Style. Those two things don't really seem related, and that's because they aren't. Cry about it. The first thing I did in this world was to search for a Crimson Altar. This was because I hadn't played Calamity mod since Malice mode was added to the game, and at that time you still had to craft the items to change the mode. I had originally planned on making this a Master mode, Malice mode For the Worthy playthrough, but Calamity mod had just removed Malice mode when I started the playthrough, and I was actually super disappointed. But the devs had recently removed it because it was too unbalanced, and no playtesters had actually beaten the Exomechs. What really disappointed me about this was that I had been training for months in order to be physically and mentally strong enough in order to take on the challenge that Malice mode offered. Once I finally reached the Crimson Altar without dying to the treacherous lava lake, I was surprised to find that there was no item to craft that enabled Death mode. I was actually afraid that they had also removed Death mode, but then I finally opened my eyes and saw that there was literally a difficulty selector next to my minimap. Now that I was in Death mode, the real challenge could begin. Terraria is a game that has different classes of damage, the classes being melee, ranged, summoning, and magic. Calamity mod actually also adds another class known as the Rogue class. For this playthrough, I decided that I would play the melee class, since it was a class that I had never actually done a full playthrough of the game with before. So, with my big, thick copper broadsword in hand, I set out to gather supplies for the first boss fight. I died to plenty of worthy adversaries along the way, such as a giant sand monster, a lump of sand, and a spider that had the unique ability to break the sound barrier. Eventually, I came across a red potion that claimed it was only for the worthy, and seeing that I was in a world that was supposedly only for the worthy, I decided that I should drink this scrumptious, delicious treat. I was wrong. After discovering that I was in fact not worthy, I was faced with the task of surviving my first night. As a man who isn't afraid of taxes or death, I'm naturally afraid of the dark, so I built myself a box in which I could surround myself with torches and choke back tears as I realized that it was too dark outside to see 10 feet in front of myself. While I was inside, I also crafted my first weapon upgrade and also the weird plastic thing at the end of a shoelace, since it made me run faster for some reason. Eventually, I stopped being a little bitch and decided to fight off the zombies outside and made it through the night. In the morning, I crafted a bit of armor and set off into the world again, only to get overhydrated by a sand monster and have to respawn. On my way back out to the desert, though, I found an accessory called the Rover Drive, which essentially gave me an extra 50 hit points and was super helpful to me in the early game. Over the next couple in-game days, I continually threw myself into the underground jungle in hopes of getting a couple items that I needed for a weapon, the Blade of Grass, and I found varying degrees of success. In other words, I got my cheeks clapped by giant hornets for about 45 minutes before I gave up and went to get more medals to get myself a gold broadsword and tungsten armor. Eventually, I felt confident enough to return to the jungle and was able to collect an accessory called the Giant Shell, which served to give me a bit more defense and also was a dope looking shell, so I was pretty happy about that. At some point, I gave up on the jungle again and decided to look in the marble cave for some loot and came across a locket that made swords spin around me. I thought that having as many swords as I could on my side was probably a good thing, so I equipped the item. I also crafted some gold armor for myself and built the terraria equivalent of Ohio for my NPCs to live in. I then returned to the jungle to finally get all the materials that I needed for my weapons and built a magic storage system at my base. After constructing the storage system, I was finally able to craft the Blade of Grass and the Amazon, which were weapons that I would be happy to use against the Eye of Cthulhu. When I first used my Blade of Grass, I was surprised to find that it was absolutely enormous, and that it wasn't a reasonable size for a man's sword to be. I wrote a complaint to the mod developers that the size of the sword made me feel self-conscious and that the sword expectations that the mod put on me were grossly unrealistic and should be adjusted. When reviewing my sword in real life, it was clear that it was not over twice my height, and I was sorely disappointed. Moving on from unrealistic sword size, I went back to the jungle to try and gather a jungle rose so that I could craft a weapon called the Yateveo Bloom, and spent a half hour breaking grass in hopes of getting a rose, but was eventually interrupted by an Eye of Cthulhu appearing and raining on my search. The Eye of Cthulhu appearing caught me by surprise for sure, and I didn't expect to beat it since I didn't have Hermes boots and couldn't run, since you can't run without running shoes. However, what I forgot is that I'm actually a natural born gamer and I have the gaming gene encoded into my DNA. Every single morning, I do 2 hours of stretching before hopping onto AimLab for 6 hours in order to prepare myself for a long day of gaming. You could say that I'm an esports athlete, and because of all my physical and mental preparation that I have done, I was able to beat the Eye of Cthulhu on my first try without being able to run and using a sword. You could say that I'm a miracle worker, or at least the LeBron of Terraria if you want to be modest, or you could call me the Messi of Terraria if you're an incredibly based soccer enjoyer watching this video. In reality, I was actually completely caught by surprise by beating this boss so easily, and was wrongly convinced that this was going to be the easiest Terraria playthrough that I had ever experienced in my life. After beating the Eye, I made the Artery and the Blood Butcher, two weapons made of crimtane bars that I pulled out of the Eye of Cthulhu's still throbbing remains. I also made a Hellevator, or Hell Elevator for the uninitiated. I stumbled across a mushroom biome and found an accessory that is super useful for melee weapon users called the Fungal Symbiote. With my new gear, I decided that I might as well fight the Desert Scourge already, since the amount of testosterone I received from absolutely dumpstering the Eye of Cthulhu was going to my brain already. What was even worse for my ego was that I absolutely demolished the Desert Scourge on my first try as well. After I tied that salty worm into a bow that even Santa would be proud of, I was feeling so cocky that I even killed another one, and decided to summon a third one, but was finally humbled by that one. Reeling off my first defeat, I decided that I needed to fight a new boss, obviously, and went down to the mushroom biome to try my luck against the fungus crab. Since I was in a super silly, goofy mood, I decided to try fighting the boss without an arena at first, and was torn limb from limb by it. And I decided that arenas are actually a good thing, and got to work. Since I had figured that I hadn't taken enough L's yet, I was under the impression that I only needed one platform in the arena, and it had to be up near the ceiling. Because of this, my weak beta loser yo-yo couldn't reach Crabulon, and I just kinda sat on the top platform with my dick in my hands and dropped stars on the boss every once in a while. Eventually, I added another platform to my arena, but this boss set the tone in my mind for how the run was actually going to go by turning me into a smooth puree of human meat. This boss took me 13 attempts in total to defeat, making it one of the toughest bosses on my tier list for the melee melee class. I decided to destroy one more Crabulon after I beat the first one just to prove that I am, in fact, the biggest dog in the park and that some mushroom crab couldn't scare me. I'm not sure whether this move made me look like an alpha male or like an insecure baby, but since I think so highly of myself, I've decided that it must be the first one. After killing Crabulon, I decided that it was finally time to get some Hermes boots and stop being such a slow little snail of a man. Once I had fast shoes, I decided to turn a Crimson Cave into an arena and fight the giant brain with teeth that was lurking down there. I failed my first attempt because I thought I could do crowd control with a yo-yo for some reason, but when I used my enormous sword, I was able to win the fight on my second try. After giving the brain of Cthulhu a headache, I went down to hell to get some Hellstone for a huge upgrade to my arsenal. I made molten armor, a couple swords, and a flaming boomerang that the game appropriately calls the Flamerang. Once I was geared up, I thought I was ready for the next boss fight, but boy was I wrong. The perforators were giving me a real run for my money. I should have realized that a boss with 3 worms would be able to penetrate so deep into my mind and body that I would be completely rendered immobile and weak. I was at this dangly toenail's mercy and was being repeatedly torn to shreds by its spikes and worms faster than I could count. Eventually, my suffering was broken up by a brief intermission to hunt down goblins. While I was tearing through them like a 1,000-degree knife through an iPhone 14, I stopped to wonder whether I was the real goblin. Why destroy these creatures if I'm only doing it for my own selfish desires as well? They attack me under the pretense of wanting to plunder my booty, but I secretly hope that they come so I can kill them all mercilessly and get a cool workstation that allows me to combine my accessories and become stronger. If goblin like gold, then gold I goblin like army goblin gold. Why do they call it oven when you oven the cold food, of out hot eat the food? Just food for thought. I ended up dying once to the goblin army, but then I was blessed with a goblin tinkerer named Eddie Spaghetti, which made my one embarrassing death worth it in my mind. I used the tinkerer's workshop to power up a little bit, and then I was ready to give that pink sock of a boss a run for his money. Also, don't look up pink sock if you aren't ready to be as based as I am. After a lot of dumb deaths in-game and actual physical pain in real life, I finally beat the boss on my 25th try. I realized during this attempt that I could just focus on the floating uvula while the prolapse of a giant worm frolicked around in the dirt like a puppy in a field of dead rats, and this strategy actually won me the fight. Since I was thoroughly humiliated by the amount of attempts that this boss took me, I decided not to fight the boss again to put it in its place like I had done previously to other bosses. Instead, I delved deep into the earth to gather materials for a bunch of new gear. The first of these weapons that I made was called the Broken Biome Blade, and even though it was broken, I could see the crafting tree that it was a part of and decided that even if I don't really want it at the moment, I will someday. Once I figured out what the Biome Blade's gimmick was, which was blades that correspond to different biomes, I scurried around the world to gather all of the enchantments available so that I could play with a bunch of different weapons. I ended up not even using the Biome Blade in a boss fight and instead opted to use the dope wind sword that I crafted for way cheaper materials. Speaking of boss fights, did someone say Queen Bee? Nope. No, nobody said it, but I just wanted to say it myself so that I wouldn't have to keep talking about how lame the Biome Blade is as a weapon and could just get onto the Queen Bee fight. I don't even like this fight at all. I feel like it only gets hard because the enemy moves so fast, but the actual patterns are super mediocre and predictable. In order to comfortably win this fight, I built myself a quaint little box underground to swing my sword at a giant bee inside of. You know, it's kind of like life, where we all spend our waking moments so that the box we end up inside of gets the job done to our liking, whether it's our homes or our coffins. Do I really need sick pillows that are super comfortable in my coffin? No! I'm currently having all the blood drained out of my body by a humanoid creature in the woods that will later take on my appearance and voice and use it to lure each and every one of my loved ones to an untimely death in the same woods that I decided to explore, even after the hillbilly in the shack explicitly told me not to go adventuring in them woods. So no, just make me a dinky old wooden box that'll splinter into pieces after they give me a Viking funeral, in which they strap my coffin to a longboard and snipe it with a 50 caliber sniper rifle as it rolls down the side of Mount Kilimanjaro. I died to Queen Bee once before clipping her wings off and watching as she fell to the ground and exploded like a SpongeBob character after falling off of a cliff. I was also visited by the King Slime moments after I returned home, and finally got some mileage out of my Biome Blade by using the sword to ride King Slime reverse cowgirl until he burst like an egg in a science class egg drop competition. Now that I had killed the 2 baby bosses, I realized that it was time to kill the awesome skeleton boss that sprays blood everywhere. You know, my favorite part of the Skeletron boss fight is that I feel like I'm on a Rob Zombie album cover every time that I fight it. Actually, if someone wants to draw me a Rob Zombie album cover in the style of Dead City Radio and the New Gods of Supertown, where it's instead of Rob Zombie fighting monsters, it's me fighting Skeletron, I would be incredibly happy to see what kind of influence I have on people after making a mediocrely funny gaming challenge video. If somebody wants to help me experience my power trip, tweet the picture at me at Wyeeett on Twitter, and I would appreciate it a ton. Regardless, this boss gave me a bit of real trouble by ripping me apart like a wishbone 7 times before convincing me to turn to performance-enhancing drugs. Moments before I took Tren for the first time in real life, I realized that the performance-enhancing drugs I needed weren't the kind that would forever ruin my physical health, but just the kind that would make me super strong in-game. So, I bought some buff potions from my friendly neighborhood alchemist NPC and went off to kill me a giant skeleton. I beat the boss on my first attempt after taking my in-game performance-enhancing drugs, and realized that these drugs aren't a bad thing at all. Not only did I grind a massive skeleton into fine calcium powder, but I also looked pretty cool doing it. The only thing that steroids are a gateway to is being really frickin' awesome and strong. This is not an endorsement of doing steroids or other performance-enhancing drugs in real life. It is only a demo to encourage the usage of buffs inside of Terraria so that boss fights can be easier. Do not liver king yourself up in real life, because the long-term detriments of a steroid-filled lifestyle are far more impactful than the short-term benefits of looking absolutely snatched. After killing Skeletron, I decided to venture down into the Terraria equivalent of Florida, with all of the decrepit skeletons of human beings going there to live out their last breaths. You know, the retirement home state. The only place in America you can go where the inhabitants actually try to hold you down and steal your youthful energy through occult hyper-Christian practices and PCP. After collecting 1 key, I decided that I actually enjoyed my youth and went home with a shiny new cobalt shield. Now it was time to face one of my favorite bosses in the Calamity mod, the Slime God. Under the impression that I was just doing them for fun and that I can quit whenever I want to, I decided to give my first couple attempts an effort without my potions. In denial, I even tried to convince myself that instead of potions, all I needed was to just go back to the dungeon in order to gather more supplies and make myself stronger. However, after I died 5 times, I finally admitted to myself that I needed the potions to be strong enough to win the fight, and I bought my dirty fix of potions. It was on this 6th dirty, drug-fueled attempt that I managed to pop the pair of oversized pimples that go around calling themselves the Slime God. With fragments of their carcasses, I also managed to craft new weapons and armor, like the Fractured Arc and the Bloody Edge, and my Statagel armor set, which was actually really fire. I was feeling pretty strong at this point, but as everybody knows, the strongest warriors are always given the toughest battles. It was at this time that I realized that I needed to build a hell bridge for my Wall of Flesh fight. Not only was I faced with this inconvenient task, but I also had a really bad tummy ache and just wanted to go to bed because my tummy hurt real bad. But since I'm an American hero, on par with George Washington and the dog from Air Bud, I still descended into hell in order to play some basketball. After getting crossed up on the court by a countless amount of hell creatures, I had only made it about halfway across one side of the world, so a quarter of the world. It was at this point that I accidentally killed a voodoo demon over a lava pit and summoned the Wall of Flesh. I was a bit startled, but played it cool since I am the LeBron of Terraria after all. And after almost killing the boss on the small stretch of bridge that I had, I gave up my dreams of being a clean all-star baller and realized that I could win this high school championship if I just did PCP. So I went off to my brewer and asked for the evil potion, and the rest was history. I finally had entered into hard mode on my challenge world after about 10 hours of playtime and a countless amount of deaths. Excited to be in hard mode and eager to get a few upgrades, I started tunneling around the world like a mole just looking for some grub. I managed to get some cobalt armor and a couple weapons. One weapon was an upgrade to my orange toenail sword from easy mode, and the other was an axe that shot out what I could only imagine was cocaine. Feeling big and strong, I decided to attempt to kill the Queen Slime, but I was met with a 50-block stretch of hollow that I could use for the fight, and a queen that was willing and ready to dominate me. It's easy to say that I did not manage to win this fight, but I did give it a good effort, and sometimes that's enough. With that, I went to bed in real life, and woke up to get going on a full day of Terraria work. After a bit of intense farming where I managed to get myself a pair of wings and a giant hammer, I was greeted with a lovely power outage. This caused my OBS to stop recording without saving the footage, and I lost a fairly insignificant amount of footage of me farming. However, this isn't the last time that this recording session would be struck with misfortune from power outages. Luckily, I did manage to record a nice 3.5 hour stretch that covers a lot of the upcoming footage that you'll see. I farmed a lot in the next half hour or so, grinding out a few biome mimics and gathering some nice weapons and accessories until I built up the confidence to face the dominatrix that they call the Queen Slime once again. I almost had her on my first attempt too, but was plucked out of the air by a small circle with wings that just really liked the airspace that I needed to survive. Eventually, I was met by a destroyer auto summon, and was sad to find out that this boss wasn't going to be the same Cinderella story that the Eye of Cthulhu was so long ago. I barely took away a third of the boss's health before my life was cut short by a
death laser.
I also realized as I was fighting this boss that what the Calamity mod does to the Destroyer is a masterclass in this mod's unrealistic portrayal of worm size. First, the massive blade of grass, and now the unrealistically massive worm called the Destroyer. Personally, I think a worm about the size of the first perforator worm is the perfect size, and I would rather have that thing hitting my soft and supple body than the enormous Destroyer that pulverizes me into a pulsating lump on the ground with a single fluid motion. After my embarrassment with the massive Destroyer, I decided that I needed to farm the materials to craft a cryo key and fight Cryogen. The last time I had faced Cryogen in Terraria had been on my Master Malice mode world a few months ago, so I figured that I could easily destroy the Master Death mode version of it. To prepare for this fight against Cryogen, I built the new largest arena in my world. I decided to build this arena out of pumpkin platforms because, quote, I am the GOAT. Pumpkin platforms because I'm the GOAT. It's clear that I say the most intelligent things on the planet as I'm playing the game by myself, and the absolute gobbledygook and chicanery that I spew on the regular as I'm playing only makes me wish that I had the bandwidth to stream my playthroughs somewhere so that someone else could enjoy me at the lowest mental state of my life. However, I'm cursed with an internet speed of 2 megabits per second download and less than a megabit per second on upload. So I'm stuck in my own brain to rot as I play through my challenges. Eventually, I finish my based pumpkin arena, needing to throw in a couple ice platforms at the end to keep the pumpkins fresh. Now it was time to face Cryogen in the marketplace of ideas. At this point, I was still under the impression that I was strong enough to face bosses clean. But after being disassembled by Cryogen 3 times, I realized I was too weak to beat a boss without my potions, and relapsed back to using substances to feel stronger. I managed to squawk out a clean victory against Cryogen, and then remembered that I still hadn't beaten the Queen Slime, and used my dirty leftover potions to go and rip the Queen Slime a new one. Still feeling awfully cocky, I figured that my double leftover potions would be still enough to take out the twins. And I was almost successful until the giant metal eyeball with sharp teeth ate me in one bite like a pit bull named Sugar after seeing a toddler in a stroller. For my second attempt, I got fresh potions and reattempted the fight. To refer back to the toddler with pit bull metaphor, this time I was a responsible parent and I filled my toddler's Gerber baby food with creatine monohydrate and protein powder, so that when my toddler is faced with a pit bull named Sugar, my infant son is strong enough to punch the pit bull so hard that it would enter anaphylactic shock from being allergic to the intense whoop-ass and instantly die. With the twins out of the way, it was now time to sail the 7 seas and fight another worm boss. However, before I could sail the 7 seas and fight the aquatic scourge like the pirate that I am, I needed some shark fins in order to make the seafood that I needed to summon the boss. While hunting for shark fins on the other side of the world, I stumbled across the Leviathan, which is a boss that I am not intended to fight for a while. But I still put up a valiant effort and nearly killed the giant sea monster half of the fight. Once I had acquired my seafood, I went and attempted the fight against the aquatic scourge so clean from my drugs that I would get kicked out of a Taco Bell for not testing positive for anything on a drug test. To make up for my sobriety, I decided to use my cocaine axe to attack the boss, and I ended up beating it within an inch of its life before being knocked out of the air by its scary teeth and dying. After my near victory without drugs, I realized that there was no way I could lose if I did obscene amounts of every performance enhancer I could imagine. I ended up winning on my second attempt, proving that there really is nothing that you can't accomplish when you have every illicit substance known to man flowing through your veins. After beating the boss, I was greeted by a fun little acid rain event, and for some reason I couldn't stop thinking of the song Chocolate Rain during the whole event, which made me feel pretty old and decrepit like a Republican politician. After my acid rain fun, I tunnel around for a bit more in order to get myself a set of orichalcum armor and prepare for the Destroyer boss fight. This fight took me a grand total of 4 attempts, with the first one being the auto summon, and the first attempt after the auto summon being buffless. However, my second to last attempt featured buffs, and I'm actually embarrassed to say that even with buffs, I was twisted into a pretzel by the largest pretzel-like object that I had faced on my journey yet. On the next attempt, I used my cocaine axe, which apparently turned out to be the GOAT for any early hard mode worm boss, and it served me well in this fight similarly to the aquatic scourge. To chase my victory on the Destroyer, I immediately turned around and challenged Skeletron Prime, and I'm happy to say that this was the easiest boss I ever faced in my life. This means that I can add it to the S or F tier on my bosses in this run by difficulty tier list, depending on whether S means challenging or easy, because I was able to squeak this boss out on my first try without suffering even one measly little death. Sadly, I didn't get any mileage out of my cocaine axe on this boss, and wouldn't use it in its current form for a boss fight ever again. With hollowed bars now available after killing all of the mech bosses, I was able to make a couple of upgrades to my arsenal. I upgraded my Biome Blade, which still ended up being fairly useless. I also upgraded my Bloody Edge to get the true Bloody Edge, and I also got a brand new weapon called the Catastrophe Claymore, which, aside from having an alliterative name and looking dope, it also was a pretty good weapon. I also created a giant throwing hammer, and it actually ended up being my favorite weapon in this round of upgrades. With my new gear, I decided that it was time to venture into hell to face the Brimstone Elemental, the boss with boobs that makes incels all over the world cry due to its femininity. I end up absolutely destroying this boss, which probably scores a point with the incel portion of my audience, and I'm pretty sure that's not a portion of my audience that I want to score with, so I have a few words of wisdom to bestow upon you guys now. Maybe the reason that the most attractive girl at school doesn't want to go out with you isn't because females are a problem, but is instead because she puts a lot of time and effort into her appearance by working out and maintaining proper hygiene and dressing nicely, and she wants to go out with someone who puts a similar amount of time into caring for himself. And furthermore, she would want a person that cares about his own appearance to also exhibit personality traits that aren't absolutely violent, hateful, and toxic towards women so that she could feel safe around you. Just food for thought. Now that all of the incels have been scared away by the actual truth of how relationships work, we can continue this video incel free. Thank me later. I also want to point out how this is a huge dodging skill fight, and I ended up killing the dodge timings even though I had weapons of a higher tier. And I'm pretty certain that I could have done this fight buffless with weapons of a lower tier like my Caustic Edge pretty easily. The next boss up was Calamity, which is a boss that I consider to be fairly easy. I even managed to do a pretty good amount of damage buffless and using the complete wrong weapon out of all of them that I had available to me at the time. It was at this time that I finished my 3.5 hour recording and decided to go to bed. When I awoke in the morning, I was greeted by a power outage, a massive blizzard of 18 inches of snow, and the worst bout of influenza I have ever experienced in my life. I was practically landlocked with my little Subaru Outback being way too small to cut through the unplowed roads to carry me to the hospital, and the house was slowly getting colder and colder as the power was out. Worst of all, I couldn't use my day of isolation to work on my incredibly important Terraria video that was going to change the world for the better and solve world hunger and end all war. I was faced with a real predicament and was being barred from my holy purpose to save the world from all despair by making a mediocre Terraria challenge video. By 7 that night, my power finally came back on for a good amount of time to get to work, and I could finally fight against Calamity. On my first attempt back, my voice is dead beyond belief, but my spirits are high and I nearly beat her buffless. The next try, being the esports warrior that I am, I squeak out an easy victory with buffs and using my giant throwing hammer. After this easy victory, I faced what was perhaps the first boss that I couldn't just beat because I had buffs activated. This boss was Plantera, and she gave me a run for my money even with a ton of buffs active. Luckily, the only thing I had to do to fix this problem was to add a bit more size to the silly little box that I made for myself when I was fighting the Queen Bee. And then this fight eventually sorted itself out. With Plantera defeated, I was able to make a few more huge DPS upgrades. I was able to upgrade my orange toenail sword into a fork and bring back the arc so that I could finally learn what parrying meant. And I was actually kinda mad when I figured out how insanely good parrying can actually be. Now it was finally time to go and fight the Leviathan, and I felt so cocky after my first encounter with it that I thought, yeah, I could probably beat the fight first try with buffs. I was wrong. My loss to this boss embarrassed me so badly that I actually decided to go fight both the Frost Moon and the Pumpkin Moon. And even better, I was clapped by both of those events as well. Luckily, after my slight existential crisis with the moons, I decided to return to the Leviathan and ended up absolutely bodying him, and was rewarded with a good healthy dose of dopamine and serotonin. I don't know why I got demolished the way I did on my first attempt, but after the success of my second attempt, I was super happy and ready to continue kicking ass. Now enter Astrum Aureus. When a boss from the Calamity mod has a name that translates from Latin into Golden Star in English, you know that life is about to become hell. Unbeknownst to me at the time, this boss enrages when outside of the astral infection biome, and I was just too silly and goofy to piece together that maybe the boss isn't regularly as energetic as a toddler on a double lethal dose of both methamphetamine and bath salts. Because I was scared off by this boss's energy, I ended up stealing the altar out of the lizard temple and transporting it to my arena. I was also surprised to find that they had, quote, made the golem hard, failing to deduce that I had actually enraged the boss by moving the altar out of the temple. Defeated and sad, I ended up taking a break to blow my nose and cry, like most sick people do when they feel like burning garbage. I returned with the idea to get a contaminator with a bunch of astral solution to turn my snow biome into an astral infection biome, and I was surprised to find that this was the first good idea that I had ever had in my entire dumb stupid life. I ended up absolutely destroying Astrum Aureus on my first attempt after trying this one simple trick. After that success, I decided that I could just suck it up and deal with the golem them in its enraged state, like the esports athlete that I am. And I ended up winning that fight on my second attempt in this new burst of esports energy. You could say that I'm a Terraria prodigy, and I probably deserve the Terraria version of a Purple Heart. You'd probably take that award back after seeing that the bosses that I've died to the most so far are the Perforators and Crabulon. I'd say the War Crimes are probably another good reason to take the Purple Heart back, but we don't talk about those. After the golem was defeated, I had a good enough pickaxe to mine scoria ore at the bottom of the abyss, and I could make a ton of upgrades to my weapons and armor. I upgraded my throwing hammer and made a cool katana. All was good with the world, and I was about to fight the Empress of Light for the first time ever before, since I've never actually done a full playthrough of Vanilla Terraria 1.4 before. I was surprised to find that the Empress of Light was probably the most fun Vanilla Terraria boss fight that I had ever done, and I left that boss fight with both a first try under my belt and a grin that spanned from ear to ear. I was even praising the fight afterwards, even though it hurt me to talk in my weakened, influenza-ridden state.
That was a really fun fight, though. What the
After this high of being happy with my performance in a fight, I decided that the natural next step was to build another huge jungle box in which to contemplate the philosophy of why we even live. This box wasn't only larger, but as I would find out soon, not large enough for my purposes. I was making this arena to fight the boss that I hate the most in Calamity, the Plaguebringer Goliath. This boss is like Queen Bee 2 and amplifies each and every trait that the Queen Bee has that I hate. This boss charges really fast, but has this new gimmick of a diagonal dash that makes the fight even harder, and guess what? He shoots more projectiles than before that do this funny little trick called homing. I was secretly happy to just be building a box like a silly little labor fan, hoping that I may never have to face the boss, but oh, face the boss I did, and I very quickly discovered that I needed an arena that was much taller if I was ever going to win that fight. Sadly, this realization didn't prevent me from giving the boss 3 more tries before resigning myself to more hard labor to make the perfect box to die in. For this iteration of massive box to fight boss, I decided to dig further into the earth in hopes of making the box taller. This didn't take nearly as long as I was expecting because of my cool drill mount that tears through the mud on the ground faster than you can say. 2,977 people were killed in the September 11th attacks in the year 2001. Much like the Twin Towers, I was still going to be hit repeatedly by a large flying object moving at an incredibly high speed, even though I had made my arena taller. It was incredibly naive of me to really think that I would suddenly start having fun when fighting the Plaguebringer Goliath just because I made a bigger box. After about an hour and 20 minutes of hard labor, I felt that my arena was ready to rumble in, complete with a nice tile floor and some platforms to stand on. After 5 more unsuccessful attempts, I eventually gave up and tried fighting the Ravager so I could be stronger. After dying to the Ravager twice, I decided that maybe I should just stick to a boss that I can kill with my eyes closed and went to fight Duke Fishron. This was the best decision I ever made because after beating it, I was blessed with a weapon called the Briny Baron. This weapon ended up saving me at a time in which I was sick and cornered like a rat by 2 modded bosses that made me really sad. I used the Briny Baron first to puree the Ravager, and after a short break to view the beauty of a solar eclipse, I also went to fight the Plaguebringer Goliath and successfully turned him inside out like a sock that I wanted to get another day of use out of. After the Plaguebringer, I spent a bit of time farming so that I could have a few more cool weapons to show all my friends in the village. After the Dryad called the police because I was disturbing the peace with lethal weapons that have the potential to kill gods, I decided that it was time to go out and fight the lunatic cultist and some lunar pillars. After killing the lunatic cultist, I began my lunar events by farming the vortex pillar, and then I hit up the solar pillar so that I could make some cool weapons like the solar eruption and the daybreak. With my arsenal fully kitted out with insanely good tools, I felt I was ready to attempt Astrum Deus, or another boss with a Latin translation. This one means star god, so that's pretty cool. I ended up getting decimated on my first attempt and went to fight a Martian Madness in order to feel better. After getting spanked by a bunch of aliens, I decided to give Astrum Deus 2 more attempts before throwing in the towel and taking a break. You remember when I foreshadowed that the power going out would cause me to lose a bunch of footage? Well, this is the moment that fateful power outage occurred. I had beaten Astrum Deus and the Moonlord, with the Moonlord taking a total of 3 attempts before I reduced him to a skeleton on the ground, and Astrum Deus took me 4 more tries before I sealed that deal. I was in the middle of crafting some wonderful upgrades when the power decided to go out for an hour, leaving me with huge in-game progress and no footage to show for it. Feeling disappointed and a little defeated, I decided to throw myself at both bosses with no buffs and my new weapons to make a dramatization of the fights that I had done before the power went out. But I was way too lazy to put in any real effort or spend money on buffs, and I died to both of them before deciding to just move on and prepare for the Profane Guardians. To prepare for this boss, I decided that I needed a weapon that was crafted from a drop from the Plaguebringer Goliath. Unknown to me at the time, 10% drop rate on the wiki directly translates to 30 minutes of farming a boss and opening 17 treasure bags. For all my statters out there, it was one of those awkward moments when the theoretical probability was not occurring in your experimental probability testing. Now that all the stat majors out there have been validated, it's time to get on to the Profane Guardian boss fights. I fell on my first attempt, but was able to squeak out a pretty easy win on my second one. After my successful second attempt, I decided to farm a few fights in order to attempt to get an accessory called the War Banner of the Sun. Sadly, I got clapped by probability once again and decided to just forget about getting the accessory, and I went on to fight the next boss on my hit list, the Dragon Folly. And boy did I tie this one up real quick. I hit that dragon bird with the meanest right hook this side of the Mississippi and KO'd him in the first round in front of his gosh darn mama. Feeling pretty good about this massive victory over a fairly easy boss, I decided to jump immediately into the Providence boss fight because I still felt like the biggest dog in the yard. I was immediately destroyed by forgetting that being too far away from the boss cooks you like 6 pizza rolls in an air fryer. After getting torched by my own stupidity, I had one valiant effort where I almost pulled off a win but lost the endurance battle. For my next attempt, I was tempted to try meth in order to keep myself awake for long enough to finish a full Providence boss fight, but I instead opted for a Rockstar. This fight is a bigger feat of endurance than running the Boston Marathon barefoot over broken glass. I spent a full 10 minutes and 10 seconds between the beginning and the end of this fight, which is longer than even the strongest hamster in the world would last before experiencing the most gruesome death imaginable to a window air conditioning unit and a block of Gruyere cheese. These are two objects that could never be related in usual circumstances, but any hamster worth its weight in crude oil would find the most spectacular way to die to both of these objects simultaneously. Eventually, Providence fell, and Rhode Island was forever saved from its greatest demon. For my next boss fight, I will be fighting the entire city of Gary, Indiana, in order to save Indiana's reputation and move it up to the 48th best state in the country above New Jersey and Mississippi. After defeating Providence, there are plenty of brand new items to make, with a new aura spawning into the world and fun to be had everywhere. I geared up with a new armor set and a few more weapons in order to prepare for the next few boss fights in my crosshairs, the Sentinels of the Devourer. In order to prepare for the first of these bosses, I spent a full hour excavating the dungeon in order to make a cavernous box to fight the ceaseless void inside of. This boss was remarkably easy, and I was a little sad about having spent an hour on the arena that I fought it in. Luckily, I'd get some use out of the arena later on, but that was spent on a very easy boss as well. Ceaseless Void is such a silly little boss because it is literally just a mouth that flies around and shoots orbs. The last time I fought this boss was a long time ago, and it had like 500 health or something funny like that, and spent the entire fight invincible and revealed itself so you could do 200 damage before going invincible again. It's always been an easy fight, but it's a fight that I really love, and I hope that Ceaseless Void never stops being the silliest little guy on the boss list. Ceaseless Void praise aside, I was now forced to fight the lamest sentinel, Stormweaver. This boss tickled me so incorrectly that I decided to go to bed in order to escape my torment. Even in my palace of me, I couldn't escape the trauma that the Stormweaver inflicted on me. I was thrashing around in my bed like a fish in a desert, mainly because I couldn't breathe with influenza, but also because I saw Stormweaver whenever I closed my eyes. It was a dire situation, and I was in fact in agony. Luckily, I was able to lay my tormentor to rest the next day after only 2 attempts, and I was so happy that I descended into hell to build an arena for the last sentinel. Luckily, the only thing I really had to do was build the arena, since the boss was so easy that I ground him into 98% lean beef on my first attempt. Like, seriously, the Sentinels of the Devourer are composed of 2 super easy bosses and Stormweaver, which balances the trio of them into a higher tier boss only because the Stormweaver is so painful to fight that it brings like the whole group average to an 8 out of 10 on the most hardness scale. Moving on from the Sentinels of the Devourer, now it's time for another easy boss. For this one, I had to return to my dungeon arena to fight Plantera 2. This boss is called Poltergeist, and it's one of my favorite bosses in the entire game, because it adds a layer of difficulty to Plantera that comes from making the player dodge new dashes and doubles the boss. It's actually a masterclass in improving a previous boss fight and a fun way to play. You would think that with my outward hatred toward Plaguebringer Goliath, I would hate this boss, but I actually love this one. I would marry Poltergeist if I could, but Poltergeist obviously doesn't return my love and attempted to kill me, so I decided to kill it with my cool laser toenail sword. Just because I like Poltergeist a lot, I've decided that the bosses that I beat on the first try get the S tier half of the tier list, so I can put Poltergeist in the S tier. It was after this fight that I discovered the best money-making strategy on the planet. I just had to use swarm summons of the Wall of Flesh and put a water bottle on the left click of my mouse. This strategy had me killing hundreds of walls of flesh while I went off to do things more important, like going to the gym, cooking nutritious meals, vehicular manslaughter, and recording my podcast because I am a white loser in the year 2023. When I return to my desk, I'm greeted by 250 treasure bags and get to watch as my money increases dramatically in a very short period of time. This must be how Jeff Bezos feels when he sucks the lifeblood out of his workers to make a bigger number in his bank account. After becoming really rich, I set off to complete the Acid Rain and fight the Old Duke. It turns out that the Old Duke is actually the hardest boss in the game, and I was sad to discover that the devs made the boss completely unbeatable. unbeatable. Or at least that's what I decided was the case after I got clapped with full buffs after completing the entire Acid Rain event once. What's even crazier is that I even tried the whole entire event again, and then failed on the boss fight one more time. Hardest boss ever, and I decided to skip it. Now it was time for the first of the mega bosses of the game, the Devourer of Gods. I was ready for the long haul on this one, or at least that's what I thought before I died 4 times and got really sad and took a break. After my break, I decided to turn the sky into an arena and build platforms that span the entire sky with a convenient sky bridge item. I also removed all of the islands in the sky, and with my new arena build, it was time to spend hours trying to beat this boss. Oh, and hours I spent. This boss taught me both how to love and how to feel pain. I learned that the two emotions are linked, but also somehow completely separate. The Devourer of Gods also taught me that I am lame as hell and need to work harder. Once I worked harder, I was finally able to put this worm to bed. It only took me 3 days of attempts, but I finally did it. My reaction to winning was even somewhat energetic. I did it! Oh my god, I did it! Holy that was so intense. Oh my god. Oh my god, I'm so happy. Oh, Jesus Christ. Oh, no way. No way. I actually expected to be cold and lifeless when I finally won, but I somehow filled up with childlike wonder. I felt like a kid again, shaking a box on Christmas Day to hear an Xbox clanging around inside of the wrapping paper. I was like the critic in Ratatouille, but instead of my food being ratatouille, it was a gummy bear made out of mayonnaise, just like Mama used to make. After this victory, I went off and did a bit of gear preparation to get ready for another incredibly tough boss fight in the jungle. I fought some pumpkin moons and frost moons and some eclipses to get materials for my weapons and armor. I even tried another acid rain, only to discover that the old Duke was in fact still the hardest boss in the game, and that my naivety was childish and that I should never underestimate the strength of the old Duke again. At this point, it was time to prepare my arena for the jungle dragon boss fight I was about to undertake. First, I summoned the boss in order to figure out where I needed to build the walls to protect myself from being incinerated by the boundaries of the fight. With this painful death suffered in the name of science, I was ready to fully prepare my arena. At first, I avoided blowing the roof off by party rocking too hard, but eventually I caved to the pressure of a few more deaths and let some natural light into my death box. Now with my arena fully prepared, all that was left to do was to figure out how the hell to even kill that thing. I tried all sorts of fun and goofy weapons to varying degrees of success. Eventually I was told by the wiki to use the one weapon that I thought was probably the worst for the fight, and I was surprised to find out that the people who write the encyclopedia on the mod might actually know what they're talking about. I also did some introspection to figure out if maybe I was the problem and I was the reason that I couldn't kill the boss, but then I realized that I couldn't be the reason that I feel sad, and that only those around me influence my sadness and not my own bad decisions and tendencies. I'm actually a perfect being, tainted by the evil of those around me. I am without fault and therefore cannot be wrong. Remember that the next time you argue with me on the internet about whether or not the cylinder of 5.1 inches in length and 4.5 inches in girth that I have gotten mysteriously stuck inside of a mini M&M's tube filled with both butter and mashed bananas is my penis or not. It is obviously a cylinder, or I would have just said that it is my penis. Eventually, even a jungle dragon must fall from the sky, and it was by my meaty mittens that the deed was done. By causing this bozo to fall off, I had proven myself worthy of the awesome Metal Gear Rising Revengeance sword, and was able to make some cool armor and weapons to go along with it. My favorite of these weapons was the dragon that I had simply held by the tail and swung at my enemies. I just thought it looked silly, and it was also the weapon that I used to kill one of the next bosses. Speaking of the next bosses, I was met with the final 2 bosses in the game, which are intended to be fought around the same time in no particular order. These bosses can be described as Angry Wizard Lady and the whole cast of the Transformers. Both bosses are incredibly difficult and take incredibly precise movements in order to dodge their attacks. Luckily, I already had all of the supplies to attempt to beat Supreme Calamitus, aka Angry Wizard Lady. Oh wait, no, there's a word for Wizard Lady. Angry Witch. Sick. But in order to fight the whole Transformers gang, I needed to wait a really long time to get enough power cells to make up for an entire game's worth of ignoring the dumb tech weapons. This waiting took me about 6 real-life hours before I could actually try the fight. Not until 5 hours in did I consider gathering more power cell factories to speed up the process, and then the rest of it happened pretty quickly from there. In the meantime, I was desperately trying to beat Supreme Calamitus to no avail, but finally I was able to face the Exomex and possibly have an easier alternative to Supreme Calamitus that would allow me to get more powerful by returning to that fight. I believe that the next clip speaks for itself. What the hell is going on? What the f- That was crazy. That was insane. I've never fought that boss fight before. That was rough. It actually turns out that the Exomechs are the most chaotic boss fight that I have ever partaken in my entire life, and Supreme Calamitus was starting to sound pretty nice. I had even nearly beaten the fight a couple times and was just looking for a small edge to secure the fight, but after seeing what the Exomechs had to offer, I decided that a few more attempts would probably be able to seal the deal. And seal the deal it did. After a good night of sleep, I returned to Supreme Calamitus and beat her in honorable combat, and I looked damn cool doing it too. This fight is what I affectionately call the 9th layer of bullet hell, because the amount of playing hole in the wall that you have to do in order to survive this fight would make any Cartoon Network executive salivate. I just stirred up a repressed memory in every Zoomer's mind right there. Remember when you wanted to just watch Ben 10, but you were stuck with hole in the wall? I sure do. I also remember just chilling on Cartoon Network to be hit with "The dawn is your enemy," and that definitely explains why I saw eyes in my dreams every night staring down on me like I was an ant in a glass colony. Looking back on this strategy, I think Adult Swim was incredibly based for keeping 7-year-olds from watching Family Guy by giving them childhood trauma. You've got to be facing demons in order to understand the dark, twisted humor of Family Guy after all. Back to Supreme Calamitus. I was actually in disbelief when I beat her, and I was pretty excited to see the beautiful Gale's greatsword next to where she died as a reward for beating her in death mode. What's even better is that this very weapon would be the weapon that I used to completely demolish the Exomechs. As I did the Exomechs fight more and more, I found myself respecting the machines that were dissecting me with lasers and missiles and plasma balls. I realized that this struggle that I was facing had meaning beyond feeling like a cockroach in a blender, unable to die to cuts but suffering internally from the whiplash of being tossed around. I found beauty in the chaos and eventually learned how to dodge the 12 or so different attacks that I was being simultaneously hit by at any given moment. And then, I suddenly beat the fight. I was in complete disbelief. There were no more bosses to fight, and I just beat the last one. Oh, wait. There was still one boss that I had failed to crack up until this point. It was time to do the acid rain. Maybe with my weapons that required beating the actual last boss in the game on the hardest difficulty available, I might finally be able to overcome the hardest boss fight in the game. I was met with a Herculean task to overcome, and I met it with fire and intensity, with the wrath of a god. Well, it turns out that I killed the old Duke in 1 minute and 20 seconds. I'm just as surprised as you are. Maybe the boss wasn't the hard part, and the hard part was letting go of the Terraria world that I put enough hours into to be considered a full week of work at a real job. So, in order to get some closure on my run, I crafted the strongest melee weapons that the game had to offer, and went through the boss rush as one last hurrah in my run. I saw so many different bosses that I faced along the way, and I actually felt really happy looking back on all that I had accomplished in my run. And finally, after killing 50 or so bosses back to back, I was rewarded with a rock. A rock, because at the end of the day, a rock in a video game means the same as a participation award on a race. You did it. Maybe your run wasn't all that remarkable, but you put a lot of time and effort into completing something that many people would find too challenging to do, and it meant a lot to you. Maybe you have a shiny piece of metal to show for it, or maybe you have the person that you became after pouring hours of work into something that you're proud of. Or maybe you just have a digital rock. At the end of the day, it means nothing, but the journey of completing something difficult means something. Maybe it means nothing to someone onlooking and seeing you sitting at a computer with a rock in your in-game inventory or a participation medal on your wall, but what it means to you is completely different, and it represents that personal time commitment that was meaningful enough for you to spend more hours than somebody does during a week of providing for themselves. And that's what the important part is. Maybe we all die someday and we all end up in a box that we build for ourselves, but the box isn't the important part. Even the sick 50 caliber Viking funeral doesn't matter. It's the life that you live leading up to the final moments that matters. Even the time that you spend in bed or eating while watching YouTube videos matters, because each living moment compounds to form what we call a life. And I want to thank you for spending a bit of your life watching this video, because whether you like it or not, it's a part of your life as well as mine now. So, if you enjoyed the video, please subscribe, and I'd like to thank you for coming along with me on this journey where I beat the hardest mod in Terraria.